Today I've had a series of meetings with legislators from both houses, both parties, and heads of executive branch departments and agencies to present to them my updated executive budget recommendation for fiscal year 11. As you know, under state law, the governor is required to submit an executive budget recommendation about November the 15th every year. Because we have had to cut state spending 5 different times, totaling 9.5%, and because the Revenue Estimating Committee has now, in light of that, issued a new revenue estimate for fiscal year 11, which begins July the 1st, I thought it appropriate and fair to revise my executive budget recommendation to comply with the new revenue estimate. The revenue estimate upon which the previous budget recommendation was, it included far more money than the Revenue Estimating Committee now says that we're going to have. As I say, state spending has been cut 9.5% during the course of this fiscal year because of revenue shortfalls. These cuts, as I say, 9.5%, that figure is based on the FY10 appropriated amounts. So when I say budget cuts for this year are 9.5%, 9.5% less than the FY10 appropriation. And as we talk today about my FY11 executive budget recommendation, it will also be couched against the FY10 appropriation. When I say the governor's office in my budget receives a 15.8% cut, which it does, that means 15.8% below the FY10 appropriation. You're going to see there's substantial cuts in this budget, generally 12% cuts. For many agencies, departments, 14% cuts. As I said, for my office, 15.8% cut, as much as a 16.9% cut for several accounts. And we will have, in isolated cases, even larger cuts. A few agencies, as you'll see, and departments will get smaller cuts. Part of the reason for the size of the cuts is not only the continuing deterioration of the trend in revenue collection, but also under current law, the state will receive $187 million less in federal stimulus money in fiscal year 11 than we are receiving this year, fiscal year 10. Additionally, or perhaps I should say on top of that, in fiscal year 12, we will take another cut in federal stimulus funds in the amount of about $383 million. So that means between 10, the fiscal year we're in today, and fiscal year 12, which is just one fiscal year after this budget, we will lose $570 million of federal stimulus money on an annualized basis. We'll be getting $570 million less from the federal government under the stimulus package in FY12 that we're getting this fiscal year. I make that point just to say this is a tight budget. It makes significant cuts. It can't be executed with business as usual, and the next year is going to be tougher. My recommendation of spending is consistent with both the House and Senate revenue projections. The House and Senate have agreed on a revenue number that is about $5.5 billion, including the General Fund, the Education Enhancement Fund, the Healthcare Expendable Fund, the Healthcare Trust Fund, the Working Cash Stabilization Fund, federal stimulus funds that flow through the state budget. And we've all agreed to use the same number. So this budget is predicated on the same number that the House and the Senate have said will be available. I will say to you that I personally am reluctant to appropriate 100% of the anticipated revenue, because for the last 2 years, actual revenue fell so far below what we anticipated. Last year, actual collections were 4.2% below the previous year, and this year they were 6.3% below the previous year. And the revenue estimate made by the Revenue Estimating Committee actually contemplates revenue for next year increasing slightly. And I think after 18 months of revenue going down every month, to think that it's going to go back up from -6.3% to even in the next year, I think is unlikely. However, the way our system works, this is a revenue estimate, and it's what I'm going to do my budget on. Those are the rules, whether I like them or not. Let's just start with public education. In state funds, K through 12 schools would receive $2.26 billion. This keeps K through 12 funding very close to record levels in our state. Total K through 12 spending this year, including federal, state, and local funds, is $4,574,000,000. My budget calls for spending I told you wrong. This year we're spending $4,577,000,000. My budget calls for next year spending $4,574,000,000. The difference is about 1/10%. The difference of $3 million on a spending base of more than $4.5 billion. Last year we had record K through 12 spending in Mississippi, the most we've ever spent in history, $4,633,000,000. So my budget for next year would mean we would spend 1.2% less than the highest amount we'd ever spent. So this is 1.2% below record spending for K through 12. When you compare that to the cuts that the Highway Patrol, the Health Department, the Mental Health Department, the other departments and agencies, other education programs, this is nearly maintains record funding. MAEP is funded at about $1.9 billion. My budget takes $30 million that normally would go into MAEP and creates an emergency bridge loan and conservatorship fund. The legislature has done some of this to try to help the districts that have financial trouble, and I would expand on that by having $30 million that can be used by districts that do not have enough in their reserve balances that they can borrow money from this fund. Secondly, if we have to take more districts into conservatorship than normal, which I think will be the case, this gives the State Department of Education extra money for that purpose. This is really not fair to the districts that are run well, because this $30 million could be going in and split up among all the districts. However, I think equity requires us to take something to set aside to help the districts that are more poorly run or simply have fewer resources. I would remind you, at the beginning of this school year, K through 12 schools had more than $600 million in their rainy day funds, if you include both the reserve balance fund and the 16th section income revenue fund. That doesn't include $220 million that was in the 16th section principal funds, which they're not allowed to spend. My point is their $600 million plus was far greater than we had in our rainy day fund when we began the year. Still, not every district has rainy day funds or has enough in their rainy day fund, and I think it's proper to put this $30 million aside. My K through 12 budget fully funds National Board Certified Teachers pay, which I think it has to do. All legal settlements, including the Chickasaw interest in the Ayers case. It funds vocational technical education at a high enough amount to draw down the maximum amount of federal funds that we can get for VOTEC in our high schools. Higher education would be funded at $347 million for institutions of higher learning, our universities. That's a 12% cut below FY10 appropriated. Community colleges would be funded at $216 million, which is a 10.9% cut below FY10 appropriated. Because ag units are cut more than the general universities, the overall cut for higher education is about 12.1%. Social services, Medicaid spending is up a little bit in this budget, not as much as you might expect, but the reason, of course, is that we're getting see if I can work it out in my mind, $375 million a year in Medicaid money out from the federal government. What actually happens is we put that money into Medicaid and then take some of the Medicaid money and spread it around other departments and agencies so that they're able to not take as big a cuts. We anticipate Medicaid spending will go up some because of a continued increase in the number of people on Medicaid. I do anticipate that that increase is going to slow down. Employment in Mississippi seems to have bottomed out. I emphasize seems. We can't tell for sure, but we entered the recession later than most states. The winter of 08 and 09, we saw big employment drops. By spring, that rate of descent was not as bad, and then we had another dive late in 2009. Now, after a very bad beginning of the year, the last month or two looks like we may be bottoming out. We're not going to count on that, but we can be hopeful. Right now, the biggest effect on the Medicaid budget will be that at the middle of the fiscal year, we will lose the current what is called enhanced FMAP. That is money from the federal government that they're using to pay more than 40% of our state share for Medicaid. That's about a $187 million loss in the middle of the year. So that's one of the reasons Medicaid spending will go up. Medicaid spending will go up again in 12 because we'll lose the other half of the enhanced FMAP. DHS, and I should tell you, you're going to be given a budget spreadsheet. The budget numbers for Medicaid, just so you understand, it says it in there, but you may not catch it real easy. When it talks about what we're spending in our budget on Medicaid, it includes both the state appropriation and the enhanced federal share. So we talk about $781 million for FY11. That's how much we'll spend of our money, and it includes $187 million more or less, well, actually $152 million more or less from the federal government. The difference between the 187, the total Medicaid enhancement, and the 152 that goes to the Department of Medicaid. Some of our Medicaid money goes to the medical center, some of it goes to mental health, some of it goes to the health department. So it doesn't all go to the Division of Medicaid. Human Services budget's $121 million, a very tight budget. Big part of the increased costs there for the Olivia Y case, where we're continuing to be mandated by the federal court to spend money. Law enforcement, corrections in my budget will receive $312 million, a 4.8% cut. This is another significant cut, but it's a cut that we think we can afford and not have to let people out of the penitentiary other than through the normal parole system and the normal system. We have put some extra federal discretionary money into the penitentiary system recently to keep from having to let people out. Highway Patrol and Bureau of Narcotics take an 8% cut, a 12% cut for the headquarters for the administrative side of the Highway Patrol, also for the medical examiner, and I believe a 10% cut for the crime lab. I mentioned earlier the governor's office will take a 15.8% cut below FY10 appropriated. The tax commission takes a cut, but a lot of it is because there was a one-time expenditure that was in their budget last year. We are actually giving them $2.2 million of extra funds to hire more auditors and enforcement people with the belief that we'll collect more money that way. That's something that we in the legislature agreed on. Debt service is fully funded. I do want to thank the legislature in their budget bill that sets out the amount of money to spend. They only spend 1/3 of the rainy day fund, which is what I had asked for. They only spend 1/3 of the balance in the healthcare trust fund, again what I asked for, so that those funds will last for 4 years. We've spent 1 year's worth and now 1/3 of the balance in each of the next 3 years, and that's where they are. I urge the legislature to include in the budgets lump sum budgeting for all departments and agencies. I do not think some of the departments and agencies can live in their budget unless they get managerial flexibility and relief, such as lump sum budgeting, such as relief from personnel board requirements. And so I hope that that will be in the budget as it gets passed.